In the US, the majority of full-size truck sales go to 3 brands: GM, Ford, and Dodge, and really it's not even close. More specifically, when you look at heavy-duty trucks, the trucks that aren't meant for grocery getting or your average commute, the trucks that are designed to tow and haul big loads, those trucks are completely dominated by the aforementioned 3 brands. Each truck has its pros and cons, but really we're not here to look at these trucks as a whole. We're here for what's under the hood. GM has been offering diesels in their trucks since the early 1980s, but in 2001 they made a big shift that had a profound impact on the diesel truck landscape, which is they introduced the Duramax line. So today we're gonna go on a journey and we're gonna look at every Duramax engine that GM has ever offered, from the LB7 all the way up to the L5P. We're gonna look at every single engine, what makes each one special, what makes each one unique, what's good about them, what's bad about them, and a whole lot more. So let's get into it. Now, before all you diesel guys get up in arms, yes, GM did offer a diesel engine or diesel engines in their trucks prior to 1982, but those were the 2-stroke diesels in the 71 engine family from Detroit Diesel, and those weren't really consumer type of trucks. Those were trucks that were like dump trucks, garbage trucks, semi-trucks, that kind of stuff. So those don't really apply to this video. Before we take a look at the Duramax engine, we need to understand what GM was offering from 1982 to 2001, which is the 6.2 and the 6.5 Detroit diesel engine. As some of you may know, GM developed a diesel engine they debuted in 1978, and that was the Oldsmobile diesel. Oldsmobile started with their own 350 cubic inch gas engine, took the architecture, and created their own diesel. But unfortunately, that diesel ended up having an insane amount of problems, and it was basically a turd. So when GM wanted to drop a diesel on their trucks, they took the Oldsmobile failure to heart and went directly to an experienced diesel engine builder who also happened to be under their umbrella, which is Detroit Diesel. As to why they didn't just go to Detroit Diesel for their Oldsmobile diesel engine, I'm not really sure. But regardless of that, Detroit Diesel and GM put together the 6.2 liter to be used in GM's pickup trucks. This was an iron block, iron head, 379 cubic inch engine with a pretty simple 2-valve push rod setup. With the set of applications already very clear, it was designed to bolt up to the engine mounts and transmission used in GM's trucks. To call the 6.2 Detroit Diesel underpowered would be an understate. When they dropped this engine, it produced a whopping 130 horsepower and 240 pound-feet of torque. While this power figure is pretty gutless, especially by today's standards, with new trucks producing around 1,000 pound-feet of torque pretty easily, it made sense back then. Really, if you wanted big power back then, you would have opted for the 454 cubic inch big block. Today, the 6.2 Detroit Diesel is absolutely loved by truck enthusiasts for its simplicity and mechanical design. It has no electronics whatsoever. And with such a simple design, it's pretty bulletproof. To this day, Banks still offers their turbo system for the 6.2, and it still sells. The reason is simple: people love that old engine. It wasn't turbocharged or advanced in really any way. Strangely enough, it used the same DB2 mechanical injection pump as the Oldsmobile V8 diesel. They offered the 6.2 from 1982 to 1992, when they dropped a big upgrade on the diesel truck world: the 6.5 Detroit Diesel. The 6.2 and 6.5 shared the stage through 1993, until the 6.2 was fully phased out in favor of the 6.5. By increasing cylinder bore from 3.98 inches up to 4.06 inches, the 6.5 was born. Interestingly enough, it was available in both turbocharged and naturally aspirated forms. The L56 and L65 were the turbocharged versions, and the L49 and L57 engines were the naturally aspirated engines. It's also worth noting RPO codes LQN and LQM were offered. While the 6.5 was a big step up from the 6.2, it wasn't exactly up to par with what Ford and Dodge were offering. Ford had the 7.3 IDI turbo and later the 7.3 Power Stroke, and Dodge was offering the 5.9 Cummins. Luckily though, GM was aware that the 6.2 was underpowered and the 6.5 wasn't particularly reliable, so they worked really hard on their next engine platform, which is the Duramax. This brings us all the way up to 2001, when GM completely changed everything and dropped their LB7 Duramax engine, which was a far cry from the 6.2 and 6.5 engines before it. In fact, it's such a far cry that they ditched Detroit Diesel entirely in favor of working with Isuzu. What made the LB7 special upon release was the common rail direct injection system. This isn't something that Dodge and Cummins implemented until 2003, and it wasn't until 2008 that we saw this feature on the Power Stroke engine. Like every Duramax that followed, it featured 6.6 liters of displacement, a cast iron block, aluminum heads, 4 valves per cylinder, and a single turbocharger mounted high in the center of the engine. To help fuel the LB7, GM went to BOSCH and implemented their CP3 high pressure injection pump. This injection pump maxed out around 23,000 psi, and it was mounted in the front of the lifter valley. In 2001, the LB7 Duramax output was an impressive 235 horsepower and 500 pound-feet of torque, but GM didn't stop there. By 2004, the power figures grew to 300 horsepower and 520 pound-feet. Again, to call this a far cry from the Detroit diesel engines would be an understatement. GM finally had something that could properly compete with what Ford and Dodge were offering. The turbocharging system on the LB7 is unique compared to all other Duramax engines in the fact that it used is a fixed geometry turbocharger. As you'll see later in the video, GM moved to a variable geometry turbocharger and really never looked back. Really, the LB7 Duramax was quite a bit better than its rivals right out of the gate. With 235 horsepower and 500 pound-feet of torque on tap, it was directly comparable to the 7.3 Power Stroke at 235 horsepower and 500 pound-feet, and the 5.9 Cummins at 235 horsepower and 460 pound-feet. Once GM had upgraded to that 300 horsepower and 520 pound-feet figure, the LB7 was the king on paper. Out in the real world, many LBS7 owners were reporting fuel economy numbers as high as 22 miles to the gallon, and a lot of that was thanks to that common rail injection system. Over time, and aside from the famous fuel injector issues, the LB7 proved to be one of the most reliable diesel engines ever produced. GM's first Duramax also provided a sound platform from which General Motors could build from. It featured induction hardened cylinder bores, a beefy forged steel crankshaft, cracked cap rods, super lightweight pistons, and a bunch of other great features. It was made in America, had a lightweight rotating assembly, lightweight heads, featured no EGR system or really many emission systems at all, and it was backed up by 2 really great transmission options, but it wasn't totally free of problems. Most notably, the OEM injectors on the LB7 are known for failing quite a lot. There's no lift pump. The connecting rods can't really hold much more than 550 rear wheel horsepower, which is a pro or a con depending how you look at it. The locating dowels can shear, and the water pump is known for being a little bit problematic when you turn the power up. Of course, all good things have to come through an end, and midway through 2004, GM ditched the LB7 Duramax in favor of their new engine, the LLY. Realistically, the LLY Duramax is incredibly similar to the LB7 Duramax, and for good reason. GM and Isuzu really did knock it out of the park with the LB7, but because it was their very first Duramax engine, it had a few small issues. So that's why they released the LLY, to help get rid of those issues. Most notably, the LLY features a valve train that's a lot easier to work on, a new variable geometry turbocharger for improved throttle response and more low-end power, and the addition of an EGR system. We've talked in depth about EGR systems in other videos, but to quickly recap, EGR systems work by feeding exhaust gases back into the intake to be reburned by the engine, because not everything is burned with just one engine cycle. So to further improve efficiency and use unburned fuel, it's fed back into the intake. GM really didn't have much of a choice but to add this to the LLY because of emissions regulations. It's particularly interesting that the LLY's EGR system is basically problem-free, considering Ford's 6-liter Power Stroke had some major issues with their EGR system. While it's not as popular to delete the EGR on the LLY as compared to something like the 6-liter Power Stroke, it is still something that a lot of LLY owners choose to delete. While the addition of the EGR is a slight net negative on reliability, on the bright side, that new variable geometry turbocharger had a nice impact on power, which was increased to 310 horsepower and 605 pound-feet of torque. Interestingly enough, the turbo on the LLY is actually the largest turbo used on any Duramax engine. The VGT works by using movable vanes that direct exhaust flow across the turbine wheel to improve performance. Simply put, the VGT makes more power at any given RPM compared to the LB7's fixed geometry turbocharger. This translates to an easy 500 wheel horsepower in any LLY truck with just some simple bolt-ons and tuning. While GM designed the LLY as basically an upgraded and more reliable LB7, that didn't exactly work out, as they introduced some new problems. Most notably, the LLY is known for overheating, which is a multi-source problem brought on by a handful of components. With the overheating, other components fail, and in some really bad cases, you'll blow a head gasket. Strangely enough, GM still refused to implement a factory lift pump with the LLY, but they did manage to fix all the injector issues that plagued the LB7. Because of the total lack of problems on the LB7, GM kept the CP3 injection pump unchanged between the two engines. After all, Bosch designed the CP3 injection pump for engines much larger than the Duramax, and they were expected that they would last well past 500,000 miles. Internally, they kept the same connecting rods between the LB7 and the LLY since there was really no good reason to change them. This brings us up to 2006, where GM and Isuzu really stepped up their game and took the Duramax to a whole new level with the LBZ. Of course, at that time, diesel enthusiasts didn't really know that the LBZ would go on to become such a legendary engine, and really that it was the last Duramax engine that was free of all modern emission systems that we all love to hate. Really, when the LBZ came around, it wasn't exactly needed. The LLY had fixed all the issues that were found on the LB7, and Duramax and GM were doing really well. Their trucks were selling really well, their engines were really reliable, they weren't plagued with any sort of crazy issues. So the LBZ was kind of a surprise upgrade. And this is because Dodge and Ford weren't going anywhere. They were continuing to get better as well, so GM had to keep up, and that's where the LBZ came from. Right off the bat, the LBZ produced 360 horsepower and 600 pound-feet of torque, which was more than the 6-liter Power Stroke and the 5.9 Cummins offered at that time. The big things that made the LBZ such an upgrade over the LLY are the improved block casting, stronger connecting rods, high-pressure common rail fuel system, and an updated ECU. Honestly, you could make the argument that the LBZ is the best, most drivable, most reliable, and most tunable Duramax that GM ever produced, but we'll see how that stands as we move towards the newer Duramax engines. Although GM had slightly redesigned the LBZ's connecting rods, mostly adding more material to the lower section, they didn't quite upgrade the pistons in the same fashion. In fact, the pistons are actually the weak point on the LBZ, where they were the strong point on the LB7 and the LLY. But more on that in just a second. The connecting rods are forged steel and made with a similar crack cap design as previous Duramax connecting rods. The added material ultimately means a heavier rotating assembly, but it also means more power without a rod flying out the side of your block. The general rule of thumb is about 100 horsepower or 200 pound-feet. That's how much more power the LBZ rods can stand up to as compared to the LB7 and LLY rods. The pistons, on the other hand, are known for cracking in high horsepower applications. Almost all failed LBZ pistons crack along the center line of the wrist pin. Speaking of which, the design of the wrist pin is something that a lot of LBZ enthusiasts say contributes to the cracked pistons. More specifically, the LBZ's use of wrist pin bushings is thought to be a contributor with the piston failure, but also the thinner wrist pins. For reference, the LB7 and LLY pistons didn't use wrist pin bushings at all. Best of all, GM knew the LBZ was going to make more power compared to the outgoing LLY, so they cast more webbing into the main bearing area of the LBZ's block. They also used taller main bearing caps and deeper holes for the main bearing bolts. To put it simply, the LBZ block is beefy, and you'd be hard-pressed to get one to break unless you're making a pretty insane amount of power. Interestingly enough, the same Garrett GT3788 VA turbo was used moving from the LLY. This definitely isn't a bad thing considering how capable it is, but it does suffer from some of the same sticking issues that the LLY also dealt with. Luckily, it's nothing too bad, just something to note. It's also worth noting that the LBZ was the first Duramax to be coupled with the 6-speed Allison 1000 automatic transmission, which was a big step up from the outgoing 5-speed transmission before it. As GM turned the power up, they also needed to turn up fueling to keep up with the demand. They did this by turning up the injection system from 23,000 psi to 26,000 psi, and once again they used the BOSCH CP3 injection pump. To accompany the new higher pressure CP3 pump, GM also added new fuel rails and injectors. The injectors were still supplied by BOSCH, and they featured a revised 7-hole nozzle. And best of all, the LBZ wasn't hit with any new emissions components, which is also why GM ended up replacing the LBZ with the LMM in 2007. I would like to quickly note that although the LBZ is considered a pre-emissions engine, it still doesn't have an EGR and a catalyst in the exhaust. Depending who you ask, diesel enthusiasts will either tell you that the LMM was the step in the right direction for the Duramax engine or step in the wrong direction, and it was the downgrade or the downhill start for the Duramax engine. I mean, really, you could argue that basically all diesel engines in 2007 started to suffer because of the emissions regulations and then the new emissions components, decreasing reliability and just killing engines. Thanks, EPA. Internally, the LMM Duramax is almost identical to the LBZ. In fact, it's similar to the LBZ all around, but the biggest change comes in the form of a diesel particulate filter, or DPF. Compared to the LBZ, the LMM only had power bumped up 5 horsepower and 10 pound-feet. Really, the LMM is basically just an LBZ with some added emissions components. We've covered diesel particulate filters in other videos, but to briefly recap, the job of the DPF is simple. Capture excessive exhaust soot and then burn it off occasionally through a regeneration mode. It's also worth noting that other diesel engines, such as the Power Stroke, also feature a DPF. In fact, the DPF is the addition that made the 6.4 Power Stroke such a piece of junk, but we've already made a whole video on that topic. The LMM Duramax accomplishes the regeneration procedure by using the late injection method, which is basically injecting diesel fuel into the cylinders during the exhaust stroke as a way to get unburned diesel fuel into the exhaust system. It's worth noting that this is really similar to the 6.4 power strokes regeneration method. While this method works, it also leads to the cylinder walls being stripped of lubrication, which then leads to excessive wear, low compression, and fuel diluting the engine oil. In addition to adding the DPF system, the LMM also has more exhaust gas for circulation than the Duramax engines before it. Ultimately, this called for a larger EGR cooler, and the square style EGR cooler used on the LMM is fairly robust compared to what you'd find on other diesel engines. Even with that though, it's still known for clogging up with time. The EGR coolers are also known to crack and leak from time to time. Outside the annoying emission systems that kill reliability, GM did upgrade the LMM in a few ways. Most notably, the LMM has improved heads that were superior to any Duramax heads up until that point. Compared to the LBZ heads, the major difference is the coolant passages. And really, the coolant passages are the only major difference at all. GM knew that the emission systems were going to heat things up quite a bit, so having the ability to keep everything cool was a big focus for GM's engineers. The LMM also had revised injectors, which helped to add power and offer a more complete combustion, ultimately meaning reduced emissions output. Unfortunately, the LMM uses the same pistons as the LBZ, but now with more power to deal with, plus the DPF and increased EGRs to make things even hotter. Ultimately, this means you're more likely to see a piston fail on the LMM as compared to the LBZ. If you're going to majorly turn up the power on the LMM, the pistons are going to be the biggest failing point, so definitely be sure to swap those out with some aftermarket ones. Once again though, emissions regulations were getting stricter and GM was forced to make some changes. So in 2011, they introduced the LML Duramax. Most of the changes on the LML were related to the emission systems, which did have a negative impact on reliability. Luckily though, GM had found and fixed some of the issues that were found on those earlier Duramax engines. Most notably, they changed how the active regeneration mode worked to clean out the DPF, but we'll get to that in just a second. To start, let's look at all the improvements GM made with the LML, starting with the cylinder block. The biggest changes to the block are the increased and improved casting and revised main bearing area. Like all previous Duramax engines, the blocks were cast in GM's Defiance, Ohio plant, but machined and finished 120 miles south at a different facility. Aside from the block, GM also upgraded the oil pump. They knew the LML was going to be dealing with a lot more heat thanks to the increased power output and the added emission systems, so they upgraded the pump, drive gear, windage tray, oil pickup, and more. Most notably, this larger oil pump flows 11% more volume than the oil pump used on previous Duramax engines. GM also realized that the LBZs and LML pistons were not going to hold up to the job on the LML, so they removed the wrist pin bushing and improved the ends of the wrist pins for better piston support. Interestingly enough, GM managed to not only improve the strength of the pistons, but also decrease the weight. Along with the new pistons came new connecting rods, but they're very similar in terms of design and strength compared to the LBZ and LMM connecting rods. With some changes, they were able to reduce the weight of the connecting rods, as reducing rotating assembly weight was a big focus for GM's engineers. With the improved pistons, improved rods, and improved block, the LML is well known for holding up to 700 wheel horsepower without an issue. Along with the improved block and rotating assembly, GM also improved the already very good injectors with even better injectors. Just like before, the injectors came from BOSCH, but this time around they were designed to handle higher injection pressure and better fuel atomization in cylinder. It's also worth noting that these piezoelectric injectors allow for 2 pilot injection events prior to the main event, which help keep the injection system ultra quiet. To go along with the new piezoelectric injectors was a new injection pump to replace the CP3 injection pump. Unfortunately, this was a pretty big downgrade. Injection pressure was turned up from 27,000 psi to 30,000 psi to support the new injectors and increased power output. However, the CP4.2 flows approximately 20% less fuel volume than the CP3 injection pump. On top of that, the CP4.2 pump is much more sensitive to fuel contaminants or lubrication changes. To put it really simply, the CP3 injection pump was much better in terms of the total flow and reliability. But that brings us to the 9th injector that's mounted on the downpipe. GM added this injector as a different solution for the exhaust injection type of system that they were using before for the active regeneration. With this solution, the 9th injector receives its fuel from the CP4.2 pump and then just injects it directly into the exhaust. By switching to this type of active regeneration system, the LML doesn't have the oil dilution issues that the LMM dealt with. But unfortunately, the emission systems don't stop there. Unfortunately, GM was pretty much forced to add a diesel exhaust fluid system to the LML in order to meet the stricter emission standards. By injecting diesel exhaust fluid, also known as DEF, into the exhaust after the CAT and before the DPF during the regeneration cycle, harmful hydrocarbons are converted into carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and water. By using this system, GM was basically able to reduce the emissions after the exhaust left the engine, which allowed them to keep their EGR system the same. Ultimately, this meant more heat could be used in cylinder to cut down on particulate matter, which culminates in less fuel being required during regeneration intervals. This is the primary reason why fuel economy was so significantly improved from the LMM to the LML. The last major change that GM made with the LML was a change to the turbocharger. This new turbo was a variant of the variable geometry turbocharger that GM used since the LLY, but this version featured a smaller and more restrictive turbine side, which allowed GM to choke off the exhaust and use the turbo as a brake assist, also known as an exhaust brake. Technically, it's a turbo brake, but the point still stands. This brings us to the L5P, which is the current Duramax engine that GM has been offering since 2017. All in, the L5P is still based on the Duramax engines before it, but this time around it features more major design changes and part changes than any other Duramax engine before it. Starting with the power output, the L5P is by far the most powerful Duramax engine that GM has ever produced, with a whopping 445 horsepower and 910 pound-feet of torque. Not only that, it features some really big upgrades to support that big power jump. Most notably, a much stronger crankcase. In fact, this is the strongest Duramax block that they've produced so far. On top of that, this is the first and only Duramax engine to feature a lift pump from the factory, but we'll get to that in just a second. In terms of the block, the biggest carryover from the LML to the L5P is bore and stroke. Past that, there are a ton of major changes. According to GM, the new block is around 20% stronger, thanks to the new gray iron casting combined with heat treating. All in, the new casting and slightly taller deck height makes this crankcase about 10 pounds heavier than the previous one, but that's a minor difference considering the 20% improvement on strength. On top of that newer, stronger block are new cylinder heads, and while they're not a full redesign, the L5P heads are quite a bit different than the heads on the LML. A big cross-section leads to shorter port distance from the intake valves, and drastically revised intake ports bring not only more air, but equal airflow into each cylinder, better than the previous heads. The casting also got stronger, especially in the combustion chamber of the heads. Inside the engine, things get even better, with stronger pistons and connecting rods. The rods are now constructed from powdered metal, and while they still use the same fractured cap design, it's at a new 45-degree angle and features larger rod ends with bigger bearings. Paired with those new rods are new pistons, which feature a new fuel bowl design. The pistons are taller and feature thicker walls than previous Duramax engines, and the cooling jets had around double the flow compared to the LML, which simply means more piston cooling. One of the more interesting changes that GM made was ditching Garrett for the turbocharger and moving to Borg-Warner. This new variable geometry turbocharger features an 11-blade billet compressor wheel with a 61mm inducer. For reference, the LML's turbo featured a 60.6mm cast inducer wheel. This new turbo is one of the main components that allows the L5P to make so much more power in stock form, but also a ton of power with some tuning. But they didn't just stop there, because they also decided to ditch BOSCH for their fueling system. More specifically, the L5P features a Denso HP4 injection pump to replace the BOSCH CP4.2 pump. This new pump features more high-pressure cylinders, an integrated filter screen, and an electric in-tank lift pump, which is another first for the Duramax engine, as I mentioned before. Put all this together and you're looking at an injection pump capable of producing over 36,000 PSI without an issue. With that new Denso injection pump also came new Denso injectors. Strangely enough, they ditched the piezoelectric injectors in the LML and went back to the solenoid style injectors. But these new Denso injectors flow around 20% more fuel than the LML injectors. Combine the increased flow with more injection events per combustion cycle, and you have the best injectors to be featured on a Duramax engine. All of these changes add up to arguably the best Duramax engine ever. And I know there's a lot of enthusiasts out there that are going to rage in the comments and say that the LBZ is by far the best engine ever, and I'll let you guys debate that because that's a topic for a different video. But the point is, the L5P was really good. In fact, it's so good that you can easily get one of these motors to make 600 wheel horsepower with some bolt-ons and some tuning. And for reference, any other Duramax engine would really start to struggle around 500 wheel horsepower without changes to the injectors and the turbo. So that's that. That is every single Duramax engine that GM has made, excluding the LGH, which was basically just a downgraded LML for use in their vans. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. Is there anything I forgot to add? Anything you want to add? Also, let me know what your favorite Duramax engine is. Do you think the LBZ is the best? Do you think the L5P is the best? Let me know down below. While you're down there, smash the thumbs up button. It really helps the channel. Get subscribed so you don't miss out on the future videos. Check out all the other videos on the channel. We cover diesel engines and a whole bunch of other stuff, and I'll see you guys in the next one.